Thank you, Caroline. Just so grateful to be here. And as always, it's very inspiring to see folks logging on from all over. Someone just mentioned, hello from France and profoundly, anxiously waiting election results. And I just wanted you to know that the world is with you. We're all waiting. So thanks for spending some time today in meditation and practicing at a time when politics seem to be grabbing our attention, don't they? At least for some of us, maybe not all of us in the call. So yes, I'm grateful that we're together, prioritizing practice, prioritizing awareness, consciousness, community, and compassion. I am going to jump right in to the meditation. And I wanted to underline what Caroline was just saying. My most enlivened moments on these calls are when I get to have exchanges with others. To me, that's where the teachings can be most fresh and alive, because the teachings come out of the directness of our interactions. And those interactions, of course, happen here and now. So it brings the sweetness of our connectedness as beings into the immediacy of the moment. So I hope you'll jump on when the time is right. All right, let's begin with a sit, please. As mentioned, the topic of today's call is about bringing the world into the heart. So I'd like to offer a guided meditation now. In which we begin the call by bringing the world into the heart of acceptance. There's going to be a part two to this, so stay with me. As we begin by turning the attention to the breath. As we begin by grounding the attention. In the moment. Your breath always here and now, a convenient anchor. As always, in your meditation practice, simply noticing anything that might pull you away from the moment. Pull the attention into thoughts of the future, past, worry, regret, planning. Noticing those things without judgment. And gently bringing the attention back to presence, to here and now. As you release into presence, notice, again, without judgment, if there's anything that resists settling into here and now. See if you can simply allow whatever that might be to do what it's doing without adding on a layer of resistance or pushing or strain, fighting. Judgment or rejection. And now take it one step further. Simply visualize bringing whatever's pushing, straining, rejecting whatever, in a sense, in this moment, that there's a lack of acceptance of, visualize, imagine bringing that into the heart of acceptance. So perhaps noticing first all that is outside the heart of acceptance. Anyone who knows me knows that most often I focus on process and not content, the how, process versus the what, the content. In this moment, I'm asking you to notice the content. What is outside the heart of acceptance for you right now? To make reference to what I began with today, actually what a friend from France began with. Perhaps the person that you are not in favor of being elected is outside the heart of acceptance for you. If you live in this country, perhaps the current president is outside the circle of acceptance for you. The way we treat and interact with the planet, perhaps that's outside the circle of acceptance for you. Or perhaps for you today, what's more illuminated, lit up, perhaps that's something personal. I'm upset with my partner. He or she is outside my circle of acceptance. Notice for you what is outside, and then gently and lovingly invite in. Remember that acceptance is different from resignation. Acceptance, also, just a reminder, doesn't mean that you love it or even like it or approve of it. It means that you accept that it is. If that feels difficult to be with in this moment, to see movement around, I invite you to visualize the circle of acceptance expanding. So rather than the image of bringing something into the circle of acceptance, gently allow your image of this circle to gently expand outward. absorbing bits of content along the way. Not through force, but rather through the rippling outward. Of this illusory boundary. Widening and widening until you feel this boundary, this illusory line becoming thinner and thinner, more transparent. Thinning as it stretches. More and more light filtering through this thinning line. As that which you have resisted becomes absorbed. Permeated. With acceptance. I'd like to make a bit of a transition now within our meditation. As we've gone from a narrow circle of acceptance, allowed that circle to open and expand. I invite us now to focus on bringing the world into the heart of awareness. Allow this part of the meditation to be simply about being aware of being aware. Are you aware of the sounds around you? Perhaps a moment ago, you were aware of the sound of my dog, Banke, if that picked up on the mic. Are you aware of the temperature in the room where you sit? Are you aware of how your body is making contact with the floor or the cushion or the chair? Are you aware of the ebb and flow of the breath? Are you aware of what the conditioned mind is up to? Or perhaps it's quiet in this moment. Are you aware of the quiet? Or if it's not quiet, are you aware of the activity of the conditioned mind? How much effort does being aware take? It's not a question to be answered by the conditioned mind. I'm interested in your direct experience. How much effort does being aware of the conditioned mind take? If you're on this call, you likely have considered before all the ways that we're conditioned to perceive ourselves as separate from life. Through that lens of separation, I, the ego, in the way that I'm referring to I in this moment, I have to do something in order to be aware of something else. It takes a kind of subtle doing I can either be good at being aware, bad at being aware, have better days at being aware than some other days. Through that lens, awareness is really just another activity of the conditioned mind. But notice with those questions I asked about, are you aware of the sound around you, or are you aware of the temperature? Notice now, please, how little effort that took. Do you have to do anything in order to be aware? I'm speaking now about the radiant mind. We might say big mind, the mind of awareness that doesn't belong to the small self, to the ego. Has there ever been a stretch of time in which you were not aware? If the answer in your mind, and this is again to be answered through direct experience, not noodling in the conditioned mind. If the answer is yes, there's been a stretch of time where there's been no awareness. How do you know that? Do you not know that through awareness? When I asked you to be aware of being aware, or be aware of your body contacting that which you're sitting on, what is that thing? Whatever it is, what is that thing arising in? Whether it's the sound around you or the contact you have with the chair. What is that experience arising in, and what is it known by? our body sensations recognized and known. Our thoughts not arising in the same openness, this open field of awareness, our thoughts not arising in the same openness that body sensations are arising in. What if the world, our perception of the world, what if the world was arising in the same openness? What if the world was known by the same open awareness? And now consider, please, what if you were that same open awareness? Is it not your direct experience that you are that same vastness? Thoughts arising in you, this open awareness. Body sensations arising in you, this aware vastness. Sounds arising in you, the world arising in you. What is there that's outside this? To refer back to the beginning of the meditation, a subject-object relationship with life is required in order to see anything as outside you. This awareness that's inherently accepting. You, this opened vastness don't need to try to accept. And you don't need to try to be aware. There's no need to try to be what you inherently are. What could possibly be outside this openness? This vastness? This love? Love as the recognition of our shared being, as Rupert Spira likes to call it. Rest now for a few more moments. In this recognition of our shared being, and in this recognition of who you authentically are. This vastness, this openness, this awareness. Thank you so much. I'd like to read a little something next. It's a further articulation of this process that I pointed us towards in the meditation. The movement from the heart of acceptance to the heart of awareness, the world and its relationship to that, or as you might have noticed in that meditation, the lack of relationship to that. If you're on the worldwide mailing list, you might have read this short journal entry, blog, during the week. If you've read it before, I invite you to receive the words in the same openness that you participated in the meditation. These are divided times. At least it's easy for it to appear that way. We have no shortage of conflict, no shortage of judgment, and no shortage of fear. For those of us practicing peace, for those of us dedicated to liberation, we've been offered a grand opportunity to accept what we have not been willing to accept, to give what we haven't been willing to give, and to love what we haven't been willing to love. We are being invited to bring the world during such divided times into the heart of acceptance rather than perpetuating resistance, rather than fighting, rather than rejecting, rather than fearing. While we practice this, while we practice releasing the conditioned barriers that further divide internally and externally, in light of today's meditation, while we practice accepting, we have another glowing opportunity in front of us. We have the opportunity to allow our perception of the world as something apparently, seemingly outside ourselves, to rest in the heart of awareness. This is the larger task. This is what our freedom ultimately hinges upon. It's one thing to practice forgiving someone you've deemed as an opponent, and it's another to allow your mistaken perception of an other to rest in the recognition of oneness. I'll read that line again. It's one thing to practice forgiving someone you've deemed as an opponent. That might be a very typical practice of acceptance that we can create and work with. It's a loving kindness practice, for example, can be so helpful, and it falls in that category. It's another practice in a sense, to allow your mistaken perception of an other, and in this case, an other that you've deemed as an opponent or someone you should accept or want to accept. It's another thing to let that perception rest in awareness, in the recognition of oneness. So another way to talk about this is to see the world as arising out of consciousness rather than filled with individuals who are becoming more conscious. So that sentence ultimately points to the fundamental theme of today's teaching, to see the world arising out of consciousness rather than filled with individuals who are becoming more conscious. So it's one thing, for example, to embrace something you've historically rejected. This is where our guided meditation began today. And it's another to recognize yourself as the embrace of awareness itself. Awareness that has no capacity to exclude, no ability to reject, no capacity to hold apart, to distance from. This is not a mental exercise. This is our glowing invitation. It's our doorway to lasting peace. All right. Thank you so much. As anyone who's practiced with me before knows, I rarely give traditional Dharma talks. What arises out of meditation interests me. Perhaps speaking a little bit about that theme or point to clarify. And then what really interests me in terms of teaching is the exchange that comes, because in that exchange, we're able to directly address your experience. And your experience is what I'm currently captivated by. The overall theme is of interest to me, of course. But that shared connection through getting to hear about your experience is where the distinction of you and me can fall away. Because there is ultimately no real distinction there. The veil that there's a distinction can fall away at any time, in any moment. But for me, there's a place in our exchange where there can be a falling away with great ease. So I'd love to hear from you all. And before I do, I also have a blessed duty to say something again about donations. I appreciate what Caroline said at the beginning of the call. I want to underline something she said, which is that these calls, which I know that many of the people I work with have enjoyed, not only the calls with me, but have greatly benefited from hearing other perspectives through other Dharma teachers. Having this broad brushstroke of perspectives is only possible through the support of this platform. So if you haven't donated for today's call yet, I invite you to. And then I wasn't planning on saying this, but Caroline mentioned that I would be receiving half the donations, and I thought it might interest you to know that actually, in my case, Peace in Schools, the nonprofit bringing the first 4-credit elective semester-long program within public high school walls to teenagers, is the recipient, the benefactor of that donation. I'm pausing because I think benefactor is actually the one who gives, but suddenly it's like that moment where you go to spell something and it just looks weird. I can't actually answer that right now. I'm not sure, but you know what I mean. The one who benefits from your donation today is not just Worldwide Insight, but Peace in Schools directly. So thank you for your support. most of all, I'm pleased that as a community we can support this platform, Worldwide Insight, that makes these teachings available and accessible to all. So thank you to Worldwide Insight. And thank you for participating, for showing up, for valuing your practice, and for supporting the best you can. Thank you. All right, we are at the point in the call where I scroll down to look for questions. We're also at the point of the call where, my first choice would be to have you come online and chat with me in that way. So I hope you'll consider that. Okay, we have our first question here. When you suggest that it's one thing to see the world as people becoming more conscious, and another to see it arising out of consciousness, my answer when I look into myself is that I don't know which it is. I would like to know how to explore this. And when someone says just to look or direct observation, I can't get anywhere. Any suggestions? Sorry, I have no mic. I can't call in. No worries, Sue. Thank you very, very much for this question. I think it's an excellent one. The part I'd like to begin addressing is when someone says just looked or direct observation, I cannot get anywhere. Sue, I'd like to explore that because I want to suggest in this moment that it's simply a matter of us being conditioned to believe that we can't get anywhere. So, for example, without a voice that exists within the conditioned mind, that's a product of the conditioned mind, saying, you can't do this, you don't have any direct experience. I'm interested to know what's just beyond that voice. In my experience, that voice comes at the very precipice of the moment that I am actually becoming quite in touch with my direct experience. So one way I'd like to explore this with you, Sue, is, and hopefully this is of interest to others on the call, and hopefully you can apply it to your own experience as well. How do you know, and this is where it'd be nice to have us on together, Sue, because I could find out who in your life you love, whether it's a child, a dog, a partner. But since I can't talk to you right now, bring to image or bring an image to mind of anyone or anything that you unquestionably love deeply. I ask other people to do the same. I'm visualizing my little 6-pound dog, Sweet Pea, right now, who's sitting over on the zafu next to me. So hopefully you're imagining something. It's okay if you're not, just walk through this exercise later. You now will have the exercise on hand. I'm curious to know, how do you know you love that being? You certainly don't know that you love that being because of a set of conditioned beliefs. You certainly don't know that you love that being because someone else told you that you love that being. I'm speaking today about the deepest knowing, the knowing that can be proven, if you will, through only your direct experience. So watch for any way the conditioned mind might be making what we're talking about today a doing. Well, I don't know how to do, I don't know how to get in touch with direct experience. The kind of direct experience I'm speaking of today, it's actually a lack of doing. It comes from a lack of trying or efforting. So hopefully that image of just knowing your own love is a workable metaphor for you. That's where I'd like you to begin putting your attention in your practice, Sue. For some of us, this can feel difficult because and especially on a call like this, where there's so many of us that are steeped in a practice that's based in trying and doing, trying to be more present, for example, in our lives. As I pointed out with the beginning of the meditation, there's not only nothing wrong with that, it's an important experience to have or I can at least say from my own history. But what's interesting to me these days in practice is, especially after long periods of time of that kind of approach, which again implies a subject-object relationship, I have to become more aware, for example. What interests me is what happens when that process of trying, which maintains this idea of subject, object, what happens when we allow ourselves to directly experience that which that little process of I'm trying to is all arising in. The best way I can think to talk about that in this moment is that vast open field of awareness. If that still feels a little bewildering, I invite you to go back later and listen to that meditation again, because I do my best to walk us from one point of reference or perception to another. So if for some reason during that particular experience, the attention was wandering or consistently focused on quote unquote external objects, that's not bad, not wrong, but I invite you to do the meditation again. And just to see what happens when you're not identified with that same conditioned process of distraction. And what's important to remember is that it's not actually possible to not be in touch with your direct experience. You have to be identified with that veil I mentioned, with the perception that you're separate from direct experience to perceive that you aren't in touch with it. Thank you, Sue. All right, Anne. I noticed that when I attempted to open to the world and experience oneness with the world, I felt quite afraid. Excited, but mostly afraid. How would you approach this experience? I guess accepting the fear first. Does it get easier? And what a beautiful and important question. Thank you very much for writing that in. Number one, your insight is beautifully articulated. Your intuition, and I would suggest that your direct experience of what's assisted you in the past, and therefore it's right there in the Rolodex. That dates me, doesn't it? Rolodex. If any of my teenagers are on this call, they are laughing at me right now. So that's right on hand, because your experience is that the first step that can be so useful in practice is to accept. I could not agree more. And that is actually why in this particular practice today, I started us with that image of acceptance, the image of here's my circle of acceptance. Here are the things that are outside the circle of acceptance. Here's what it's like to try to accept by bringing what's outside into the circle of acceptance, which really feeds an idea of subject-object relationship, but it's an important place to begin, because in some cases, there's such a lack of clarity about the nature of reality that we're just identified with the aspect of the conditioned mind that's completely focused on rejection. So there's no acceptance isn't a helpful practice, because it's just real and true that I cannot accept Trump. He lives outside my circle of acceptance, and that's how it should be. Or I can't accept animal cruelty. It's outside my circle of acceptance, and that's how it should be. But starting the meditation, today's practice with the focus on acceptance, is a way of acknowledging that until there's acceptance, for example, something near and dear to my heart is the topic of having a world in which we can put down, see through our conditioned tendencies to harm or be cruel to other sentient beings. The violence in that is a place in our world that could deeply benefit from our practice of acceptance, because until I've accepted, yes, something I was present to recently, we over here, there was the Kentucky Derby, which may not mean much to people in other parts of the world, but it's a horse race that, I grew up in Virginia, and the Kentucky Derby, it's a thing. Many people don't think about or consider the way horse races historically have brought great harm to many animals. One person I heard speak yesterday said there was a expectation that just based on data and research, there would be 3 horse deaths during this Kentucky Derby. So just a small example of a place yesterday I was practicing acceptance. Here's this activity that we exalt as conditioned beings, and culturally, mass culture wise, we turn our eye to any byproduct of harm that might come from this activity. But until I've accepted that that is so, again, very different from resignation or from that means I approve of it. You can hear, by the way I'm talking about, that certainly I don't approve of it. An important first step is to accept it so that change might come to be. It's because I see it, because I accept it, that I can be an advocate for more people to become aware of what actually goes on with, to use this one example that's fresh and alive for me, horse racing. Many people don't realize that these horses, once they're no longer potential winners, might be trucked up to Canada and used for meat. Now, obviously, this call isn't about horses or the Kentucky Derby, but I hope you can relate to this example of once there's acceptance, then there can be movement. And until that acceptance is there, there can't actually be movement. So to go back to your question, accepting the fear, accepting anything that's outside your circle of acceptance is a very helpful and important first step. And I just laid out one way today that we might actively practice acceptance. So accepting the fear to begin with. And yes, it gets easier, and here's why. It gets easier. I'm going to go back and see Anne. It gets easier, Anne, because we go from identifying with our sense, our perception that it is I who am afraid, to recognizing that, of course, the more our experience, our direct experience of awareness is something that we recognize ourselves to be, the more, up until a certain point, so initially, I should say, in particular, the more the ego feels threatened. So the ego, the illusion of separateness, has its life in this perception of separation. This activity, the ego is an activity of the mind. That activity of the mind can't have power, juice. It can't be effective as a device of separation if we're not feeding it with our attention. And the way we feed it with our attention is by being identified with it. So, and then the next important step, Anne, and I hope others are following along with this too, the next important step is to cease identifying with that fear, to cease calling that fear you, to cease, for example, saying that fear is mine. That fear is simply another experience arising in the open, vast field of awareness. And you need not claim it as you. The ego is eager to claim it as you, because the moment you claim that fear as you, the moment you cease wanting to move farther in the direction of recognizing yourself as something so broad as the recognition of oneness itself. So it becomes a great red light to our system. That fear becomes this flag that says, do not continue down this path. Let's go back to the place of comfort. Let's go back to the place where you are a person who's trying to be a better person. So you're trying to accept things in your life, because everybody knows that good spiritual people accept other people, for example. So in a subtle way, and then it becomes gross, but in a subtle way, we begin a frame, developing a frame in which spiritual practice is actually a self-improvement plan. And this place that we ended the meditation today, and the focal point of this particular call, really transcends that notion that spiritual practice, awareness practice, is a self-improvement plan. We're not doing this because you'll become a better person. It's very hard for the ego to come to terms with that. So no surprise when we consider something like that, that the ego will say, well, oh God, no, I don't really like this plan. I wanted to become a better person. So the ego will use anything to maintain its identity as other than, including spiritual practice. Thank you, Anne. Sue says, thank you. Oh, and for the record, in case someone else, I don't know if others can see these questions, but this is the same Sue that wrote in before. Thank you. It begs the question of how we really know anything, which I guess is a question that needs to be dropped. Again, thank you. it can be tempting in practice to fall for a subtle story that there's something wrong with thinking about things. So there can be this subtle suggestion that we get through spiritual practice that points to this idea, just no thought, no thinking, don't focus on concepts. I don't think that approach does justice to the way in which the mind of thinking can be in service, can act in service to our desire to be free. So a small example of this is, for example, indicated through our work with teens through Peace in Schools. Rather than simply introducing meditation to these teenagers and then implying that meditation can help you clear your mind, which most people come into a meditation practice believing, then they feel like there's something wrong with them because they can't accomplish that. Then they later drop a practice because, it just doesn't work for me. Something I hear people say all the time. I've found it helpful to give teens something to do with the mind. So maybe not during a specific meditation, but with the practice of creating unconditionally loving reassurances for ourselves, for example. So the teens turn their attention through our curriculum to the experience of recognizing when negative self-talk arises, and rather than just noting it and returning to the breath, noting it, but then engaging the mind by asking, what does the part of me who's the recipient of this negative self-talk need to hear? And then crafting a reassurance on behalf of this unconditionally loving mentor that's within all of us, that we create form for. Having that voice of compassion be able to offer something specific. It's an activity of sorts. So when you say it begs the question of how we know anything, which I guess is the question that needs to be dropped, rather than just dropping the question, which you can hear that I'm projecting comes from a place of, we all know the right spiritual answer is don't know mind, don't question, especially, I'm from the Zen tradition, don't know mind, don't question, because questioning implies a someone who would question. Rather than getting into that trap, I invite you to practice compassionate self-inquiry. Ask the question, how do we really know anything? Let that question enliven your experience and draw you more fully into not a concept, but your direct experience of the answer. So it's interesting, Sue, that you were the one who asked, I don't know how to turn to my direct observation. Not a surprise that I'm now turning you again in another way to direct observation. So I'm calling that in this call self-inquiry. Ask the question, how do I know anything? It's actually a great question. How do I know anything? Ask the question and then look to see, where do you turn the attention to get the answer? If you habitually just turn to your conditioned mind, what's it like to listen for your direct experience rather than simply turn to the conditioned mind? What is my direct experience of how I know anything? to go back to the example we were focusing on before, Sue, how do I know I love little 6-pound sweet pea? How do I know that? To me, I could look into and explore, how do I forget that? I get caught in the conditioned mind. I'm distracted, whatever that answer might be. But to me, it's a useful place to practice self-inquiry. How do I know anything? If you were here in person, and I hear that's not possible for you right now, Sue, I'd like to hear a little bit about your experience of this. How do you know anything? And then I would respond to that. I'm just looking to see whether you've written anything else in. I see that there's nothing else written now. So I will end this exchange simply. It's important to me to not give what might be an answer, but to rather give you pointers regarding how to explore this. And I'd love to, I do private consultations with folks, and the private consultation information, and I do it through Skype, so anyone anywhere in the world could schedule a private consultation if you'd like, and more information about that is on my website, caverlymorgan.org. How do we know anything? So Ramana Maharshi, a practitioner, saint, teacher who I deeply admire, Vineet, my husband, and I were just in India, and we got to spend time in the places that he lived within the mountain of Arunachala. If that interests you, please check out my blog posts from while I was in India. There are, I think, 5 of them, and that are all on the Caverly Morgan website under the journal tab. I have great photos that my husband Vineet took during our time as well. But Ramana Maharshi's question that he's famous for was, who am I? It's actually a very similar question to how do I know anything? We have to ask as we explore directly through this practice of self-inquiry. When I say, who am I, or how do I know anything, what I are we talking about? Are we talking about I as an ego, as a separate self? Are we talking about a different experience altogether? What is that experience? All right. Thank you, Sue. Sophie, thank you for your question. Are you suggesting we should let go of the doing of the spiritual practice? Sophie, again, if you can join, if you can call in, that would be great, because I want to hear about your experience. And if you can't, that's okay too. Well, one thing that I want to point out is when I see something that says, are you suggesting we should, inherently in your question, there, just by the framing, should, we've set up a world of right, wrong, good, bad, this, that. We've created a world of duality where there's a should and a shouldn't. So notice that that frame perpetuates the idea of a subject-object relationship. So for example, when I say, I should try to accept things, because everybody knows that the right answer in spiritual practice is to be more accepting. So I've started this practice and now I should accept things. So I do this half an hour loving kindness meditation every day where I try to love rather than hate. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. And you're onto something. In today's call, I'm specifically pointing to what happens when we open our frame for practice a bit. So that frame I should let go of X is really just the flip side of I should accept. There's still an I that's the activity of the mind of separation in charge of that experience. What I'm pointing to today is that when we recognize ourselves as awareness itself, there is no small I that should do anything, that needs to try. Shifts the focal point of practice itself. So as a practice, watch for these shoulds. When do they serve the recognition of who you authentically are? And when do they maintain a small I that needs to do anything or not do anything? Thank you, Sophie. All right. There are no more questions, I see, and we only have 2 minutes left anyway. So I will take that 2 minutes to just make a few announcements. As I mentioned, first, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing practice. I want to invite folks to be courageous in the next call on Worldwide Insight regarding coming online, and to set up your technology in advance so that that's possible, if you can. But thank you so much for those who wrote in. I have a sense that the questions that were written in apply to many, if not all, on this call. So thank you for that. I wanted to mention that we are in the middle of a campaign for supporting Peace in Schools and the expansion of Peace in Schools. We're in 6 high schools in Portland, Oregon right now. We're expanding into 2 more in the fall, we hope. And the schools want us. It's a matter of funding, really. And we're in conversation with a Dharma teacher who I respect a great deal from the Insight Vipassana meditation community in Seattle. And we are in conversation about how to expand while keeping the integrity of this curriculum, which is very extensive and involves very nuanced aspects of awareness practice. So I invite you to support our campaign if you wish by going to peaceinschools.org. Just remember your donation to this call. Half of it supports this, this experience of our expansion anyway. But if you'd like to be particularly generous and support this call so it can support Worldwide Insight, and then maybe also consider supporting our monthly campaign, please go to peaceinschools.org. We are currently cultivating monthly sponsorship. So even $5 a month, if everybody on this call gave $5 a month to becoming an ongoing monthly sponsor, it would be truly magnificent for the organization. So just putting a little plug for that. Lastly, I want to let you know that I am offering a retreat at the gorgeous Land of Medicine Buddha that's nestled in Old Grove Redwood Forest in California. Painfully, unfortunately so, there are not that many Old Grove forests left in the States. And we're very, very lucky to host a retreat at this place. I want to invite you to join us August 1st through 6th. We actually already have some folks from the last Worldwide Insight call that have signed up for it. So I'm very pleased about that. And I'm looking forward to getting to meet people and work with people in this retreat where the backdrop is silence, yet there's a lot of exchange in groups for those 5-6 days. And I invite you to join us as well if you can. And then you're always welcome to come visit us in Portland. So I'll be doing a fall urban retreat, a winter retreat here in Portland. I just want you to be part of that as you wish. Thank you for your practice. May the collective benefit of our shared practice benefit the world as we learn to recognize the way in which this world is a perception that's arising in consciousness itself. Many blessings.